going, American history students? This is Mr. Bell coming at you with another video lesson. Today we're going to be covering American History 1, sections 4.3 and 4.4. And we're going to start with the idea of a Jacksonian democracy. So, despite all Jackson's flaws of how he treated the Indians, he is remembered as being one of our most influential presidents. There's a reason why he's on the $20 bill. And he is given credit widely for creating the idea of the American dream, that you can go from nothing to live out your dream and achieve your goals, whether that be career-wise, family-wise, etc. The reason that Jackson is given credit for this is he goes from being a dirt poor 13-year-old whose parents do not care about him, volunteering for the Revolutionary War, using that money he earns from the Revolutionary War, later in the War of 1812, to go to law school, becoming a great lawyer in Tennessee, working his way up to the U.S. House of Representatives, and of course eventually to be a two-term first Democratic president of the United States. So if Jackson, whose parents pretty much essentially abandoned him, can do this, then why can't anyone else achieve their dream, whether that's starting a small business, whether that's going to school to be a doctor? So that is where you get the idea of the American dream. What is the American dream? It's changed over the course of time, right? The classic American dream of the 50s was to get married, have 2 or 3 kids, have a house, own a car, maybe 2 cars, and live comfortably. Don't have to necessarily be wealthy, but comfortably, until you can retire and your kids can have kids and you can enjoy the grandkids. That is the prototypical American dream of post-World War II up until probably through the 90s. Of course, it changes over time. Some people don't even want to get married now. Some people don't want to have kids, and that's completely fine. Everybody has their own version of the American dream. What's important is that we keep America functioning where whatever your version of the American dream is, you have the opportunity to live it, and we give people from all different backgrounds an opportunity to live the American dream. Alexis de Tocqueville, moving on, wrote Democracy in America. This is about individuality, that America will be at its best when each American citizen brings their individual talents to the forefront. If you're a great musician, but you don't play music because your father was a blacksmith and your grandfather was a blacksmith, you're depriving the American people. So bring your individual talents to the forefront. That's something that's kind of unique to American culture and, European culture to an extent that maybe is not as prevalent in Southeast Asia. So, what we're going to talk about here are a few instances of art bringing the country together, art creating nationalism, extreme pride in one's country. So, the Hudson River School was an art school in New York on the Hudson River, and they did famous paintings of American landscapes, famous politicians. Now, if you or I want to see something, we can type it in Google Images, and within a split second, we can see what Andrew Jackson probably looked like, or what Barack Obama looked like in high school, or what Donald Trump looked like in high school. If that is something that we want to see, we can see that. But at this time, they didn't have that access to that type of technology. So if you wanted to see other parts of the country, say you were in the South on a rural farm, and you wanted to see what the skyline of New York City looked like, then there was really no way to see that unless you were going to New York City. And that was not possible for many people in the rural South. So what the Hudson River School did was they did these famous paintings, and they toured them around the country. And it allowed people in the South to see stuff in the North, people in the North to see stuff in the South. And it brought the country together because it made the country in the best possible way seem smaller. That here's this stuff we talk about, right? You hear about the president, but unless you saw a painting of the president, that was all you were going to see because they didn't have flash photography yet during this time period. One of the things that's sometimes blamed for is the deification of politicians, especially presidents, almost making them look more godlike than man. And we put them up sometimes on a pedestal too high. Even to this very day, literature of the time really brought people together. Poe wrote the first horror stories. Edgar Allan Poe, poems about the Raven, Telltale Heart. You had this joint communal feeling of being afraid, being frightened, and that brought people together in an odd way, but still it brought the country closer. Thoreau and Emerson were what we call transcendentalists. They're peaceful critics of slavery, the most famous of which is Thoreau. Thoreau wrote about civil disobedience, peaceful protest, nonviolent protest. And these are things that Gandhi would use when he was trying to get India's independence from Great Britain. And these are also things that Martin Luther King Jr. would demonstrate, as opposed to Malcolm X, during the civil rights movements of the 1960s. Other types of literature and stories that were popular at the time. Going back to horror, you had longer form storytelling from Washington Irving, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, The Headless Horseman. Sure, you're familiar with this. Rip Van Winkle was a story about a guy who kind of complained about his life a little bit and felt overworked, and he overtired, so he fell asleep. And he ended up sleeping for, I believe it was over 7 years, and when he came to, the world had left him behind, and he realized he was taking his family and stuff for granted. James Fenimore Cooper wrote Last of the Mohicans, about Indians on the frontier. Hawthorne wrote The Scarlet Letter. This is about not judging people, not assuming who people are based on what they say. One of the best sellers of the time was Herman Melville's Moby Dick, about a giant whale that Captain Ahab continuously tried to catch. This is one of the best sellers. When it first came out, it wasn't that big of a seller, but as time passed and word of mouth got around, it became one of the greatest and most sold stories in all of fiction. So now we're going to go to 4.4. So this section is going to cover 4.3 and 4.4. The next will cover 4.5 and 4.6, the next video that is. The Industrial Revolution. So you have multiple industrial revolutions in America. The Industrial Revolution comes about in part because of the demand for clothing. And this leads to the creation of what we call textile mills. Now, this industry started in France and England and Europe. It was brought to New England by a guy named Samuel Slater, and he opens up the first mills in America. Now, while in the North they didn't have slavery, they did have many textile mills. It was heavily developed as far as manufacturing is concerned. They were making tons of clothes. These clothes were made of cotton. This incidentally increased the number of slaves that were in demand in the South to pick cotton. The Lowell system allowed us young girls and sometimes immigrants to live at a factory if they had nowhere else to go, in a dormitory type setting. Francis Lowell, Lowell, North Carolina, which had a lot of Lowell system mills around Gastonia, is named after Francis Lowell. So, cotton became the king of the South. Obviously not a literal king, but it made people so much money that if you could produce enough cotton in the South, you would be a very wealthy person and a power player in Southeast America. Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. It's a machine that picks the seeds out of cotton at a rapid pace. You pour the cotton in, you wind it, gets the seeds out. Eli Whitney recognized that one of the worst things that slaves had to do was pick the seeds out of the cotton. Oftentimes 14, 20 hours and sitting there picking seeds out of cotton, fingers blistered and bleeding. So he wanted to make things actually easier on the slaves, and this ended up backfiring. Because instead of having 4 slaves in the field picking cotton and 4 slaves picking seeds, once the cotton gin became a thing, you had 1 slave run the cotton gin. You had 7 more picking cotton. You were making much more money, which meant you would probably buy more slaves to continue. So this accidentally increases the demand for slavery. Here we have 2 different views of slavery displayed in art. This here is kind of what the northern view of slavery was. They hadn't seen it up close and personal. They thought that slaves lived on the plantation, but it was a pretty tranquil life. They were treated well. They didn't realize the horrors of what was going on, or if they did, they were in denial. Here you have a much more accurate portrayal in the infamous piece of art After the Sale, in which you have a mother having to give up her child because they're going to be bought from different slave owners, and this tore families apart. That's kind of the same picture from earlier, just a older version of it. Agriculture. So agriculture is a big southern thing. That's how manufacturing is big in the north, agriculture in the south. So in some ways this does create some sectionalism, more pride in one state or region than a country. Cyrus McCormick invents the mechanical reaper in order to a reaper like you would think of a grim reaper going through cutting down the weeds and stuff, or that type of not weapon but farming tool. The mechanical reaper did it much more quicker. The plow. Yeah, Jethro Wood invented the iron plow. Then you had the innovation of the iron plow by a guy you've all heard of, John Deere. This breaks up the ground so it's easier to plant your crops. This would be what we call a tiller today. Transportation. Robert Fulton invents the steam engine. He builds the first steamboat, known as the Claremont. What you have is a much faster version of transportation compared to horse and buggy, and you're able to get to places quicker than you ever have before. One of these places is the Erie Canal, connecting the Great Lakes, so Ohio, Michigan, that region, to New York City. All of a sudden you can get on a steamboat, get there in a couple hours, and it makes New York City a pretty hot destination, eventually deeming it the city that never sleeps, with plenty of stuff to do for tourists. Communication brought the country closer together. The telegraph using Morse code, and eventually the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell connected the country. At this time, nativism became a strong sentiment in America and led to a lot of hate. Now, of course, nativism in many ways is very hypocritical because we are a nation of immigrants. But a section of the Whig Party which was originally formed to oppose Jackson, known as the Know Nothing Party, they deem themselves the Know Nothing Party, aka the American Party. They're still a segment of the Whigs, and they were anti-immigration. That was their entire platform. Immigration costs jobs, immigration leads to crime, that type of thing. Abolitionists of the time, you saw more and more people speaking out against slavery. Two big abolitionist voices. One, William Lloyd Garrison ran an anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator, but Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave who gained his freedom, taught himself how to read or write, became probably the most famous and recognizable abolitionist in American history, published an anti-slavery newspaper known as the North Star. Of course, slaves would follow the North Star to freedom, to get to the North, or to eventually Canada. Liberator for liberty, freedom. And that's going to cover it for 4.3 and 4.4. Thank you so much for clicking play today. If you have any questions about this content or any of our previous content in this course, email me at bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. Thank you. Have a good day. Please stay safe.